Have we got a story to share with you this morning? And it's a rarely told story, so I feel privileged to invite you into this exploration with us. I'm Joel Levey and
Michelle Levey.
And we were blessed and challenged with an invitation some years ago. I was running the biofeedback and stress program at Group Health, and Bud Cook, who some of you know, is an Aikido trainer and a sports psychologist here in the Northwest for many years, calls and my secretary says, Joel, you've got a call. I pick up the phone. He says, hey, Wiz, how'd you like to, he used to call me Wiz for wizard. How'd you like to design the ultimate warrior training program for the U.S. Army Green Berets? And my mind kind of hovered for a moment. So what we're about to tell you is just offer a glimpse of what that story was. It was officially named Trojan Warrior because our troops were deep recon troops. They would have gone to work someday, been loaded on a plane, taken thousands of miles into enemy territory, way into Soviet Union at that point, airdropped in at night, expected to be on the ground and operative for as long as possible until they furthered their mission and likely got killed and likely wouldn't come out. So our job was to prepare them with a set of skills to be able to deal with that unreasonable set of possibilities. Though the program was called Trojan Warrior, within days, if not moments, our guys renamed it to Jedi Warrior. And they created this crest that has the Green Beret logo on it, which says Viset Tecum, the liberators of the oppressed. Underneath that it says, it says De Oppresso Libre, liberators of the oppressed. Under that it says Viset Tecum, which is Latin for May the Force be with you. So I'd invite all of you as we begin to just be mindful of the questions you hold in your mind today, to really be vigilant inwardly for the guiding instructions that have brought you to this room today, and to listen for what your questions are and to see how those will magnetize your understanding, and to realize that there's an important link between changing ourselves, deep change within ourselves and deep change within our organizations, and that as we do come to radical shifts in how we see the world and our own personal identity, it's inevitably going to change our organizations and our world. And so we'd like to not only tell you the story of the work with the Green Berets, but we'd like to invite you to consider what's the relevance for you as someone who works in a business or an organization. How could you apply some of these principles or practices in your life? And we'd also like to share a number of different practices and techniques with you.
So just as a way of getting started, we'd like to also just invite some personal reflection to make this real for yourselves at your tables. Just take a few moments and consider either of these two questions. If you had 6 months to train a group of 25 soldiers who could possibly be in a position to start or stop the next world war, what would you teach them? What would you feel, think, imagine would be important, essential to teach them? Or alternately, if you were one of those 25 soldiers and you knew you were going to embark upon a special training of advanced training program to prepare yourself for your mission, what would you want to learn? So just kind of step into this scenario with us for a little while, and just maybe about 8 minutes at the tables. Yeah. Introduce yourself to each other and see how this speaks to you.
We could go down with the tables, or we could just stay up here while they do it. Keeping in mind our mics maybe on.
Do you want to ask for the same?
Yeah.
So we'd like to get a sampling. As I was walking around, I heard a lot of very deep wisdom about wholeness and purpose and leadership and keeping our humanity. So love to share our collective wisdom. Just take a few moments if you'd like to, if you would be willing to share what came up for you or at your table, give us a sense for the insights. Thank you.
One thing I thought was to create a really tight environment and a really safe environment within that community of people, the 25, so that they can really dig deep within themselves and bring out whatever they need to, and really investigate themselves and inquire about themselves, and figure out themselves so they can work as a group in such a stressful environment, perhaps.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we talked about teaching them to operate like a jazz musician, so that all of what they learn and train comes together in embodied way, so that in the moment they can align with that force, the force be with you, and choose the right action. And that what, as a soldier, I would most want to prepare myself for is a moment of letting go, so that I might not know whether I'm going to live or die in the next moment.
As we're listening to people, I would invite you, as part of your own Jedi warrior training, to be mindful of what is elicited within you as people speak, or just the feeling tone or the thoughts, the images in your mind that are left having talked to people. You know, to really find a balance between your inner scanning and awareness of what's arising on your internal screen, as well as a deep sense of vigilance and attentiveness to what's happening on the outside, to blend the two of those in an extraordinary kind of way.
We spoke a little bit about a purpose that was beyond the person, and a cause that was greater than the self. So it drew us back to Viktor Frankl. I believe the book was Man's Search for Meaning.
Thank you.
So the issue that came up for us was really around managing dilemmas. And as I said to you, I have some experience working with the military. And as we talk about humanity and think about the larger context and why you're doing this, what I know is that there's also such a thing as military readiness, that both of those must be held at the same time in terms of how will some of the things we want them to do, as a matter of fact, interfere with their ability to be safe and effective at what they are hard to do, and how do you hold both of those as truth at the same time?
Maybe one more and then we'll move on.
Sort of chunked the curriculum into three. First was around self-knowledge and self-mastery. It had to do with an ability to be present to oneself and to be aware of what was going on inside oneself, and to be able to be masterful in the face of whatever that was. Second was interpersonal mastery, which was essentially the ability to be present to others, to handle difficult situations with others. And the third was more a sort of a system awareness and insight, being able to look at the ramifications down the road of whatever was happening now, but not necessarily just critically, intellectually. It became more Jedi-like at that point. It was more of a sort of a combination of intuition and critical thinking in terms of system awareness.
That's great, thank you. I think all of these responses really speak to different levels and dimensions of courage, that willingness to be fully present with whatever's arising within us or between us, and to stay vigilant, aware, willing to lead forward, to step into that unknown.
Okay. So there's this beautiful quote from William James, who's like really the grandfather of modern psychology, where he says, the greatest thing in all of education is to make the nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. To make the nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. In many ways, the short description of our deliverables for this was teach these men to recognize and befriend their inner enemies and to stop the war inside. That's basically what we spent 6 months full-time doing. In the process of working on this, we had 3 years. How many of you have ever dealt with military contracting? From the time we wrote the proposal, which basically we did in an afternoon almost on the back of napkins and typed it up and sent it to West Point. And they came back and said, this is the most extraordinary orchestration of human technology we've ever seen. And then it took 3 years to get the contract worked out. But during that time, we lived with those two questions of what would we teach them? And we exercise a high degree of courage in calling anybody who seemed like they may be helpful. We have an incredible network, and we work them to the max to get their wisdom. But we also were bold to call many other people and say, hey, if you had 6 months full-time with 25 men who might start or stop the next world war, what would you teach them? And we'd like to introduce you to one of our advisors on that.
So one of our mentors, advisors, is this very venerable abbot. Dzong Rinpoche is his name. He was the head of the largest monastic university in Tibet. And he happened to be coming through Seattle at the time. And we posed him the same question that we just gave you. And he reflected for a moment, and he said, through the translator, it came back to us, teach them courage. That's where the title for this session comes from. Teach them courage. And that's really all. He didn't elaborate further about what that meant. It was just like that was our mandate, our mission. And that became our organizing question. We had a lot of respect for his wisdom, and we were first taken aback. How can we, Joel and Michelle, teach the Green Berets courage? What does that mean? What levels of courage would he be referring to? And over the course of the program, we became more and more tuned into what that might mean, that might be, just as we heard from the last response, these levels of both intra and interpersonal levels of being willing to be present to the pain that might be present with an open heart. All of these different levels became apparent to us. What we didn't know until about a few years after the program, speaking with another Tibetan translator, and we mentioned that Dzong Rinpoche had told us, teach them courage, and we just kept coming back to that, and what does that mean, and listening for deeper guidance around that. He said, oh, well, that word in Tibetan that he probably used, that could have also been translated as patience or forgiveness. That translator chose to say courage, but actually the word has all those three levels of meaning. Teach them patience, teach them forgiveness. And then we began exploring, oh yes, so how did that come up in this program? And we'll elaborate on that a bit more. And just yesterday, we were speaking with Ken McLeod, I don't know if he's present, about this question, this word, because he has a good grasp of the Tibetan language. And he said, oh, well, actually also, it could have been translated as heart power, which I really like, powerful heart. So in that sense of, we heard from Peter, open-heartedness, courage having to do with the tearings, the openings of our heart. And we're getting a sense here within systems thinking context of wholehearted, being open, being fully present with all the parts of ourselves. And then here's the sense of strong-heartedness, bringing all those qualities to bear in our capacity to be with whatever's arising in the moment, fully, wholeheartedly, open-heartedly, with strong heart power. Natob.
And part of the meaning of this is it's a synonym also for the word fearlessness. And the word fearlessness is a synonym for the word compassion. And there's this implied sense of fearlessness in the face of whatever experience is arising within us. Fearlessness in the face of our apprehension or our sense of risk or whatever it may be. Compassion that's willing to be with whatever is going on with the power of the heart kept open rather than occluded. So
consider for yourself the relationship of the term courage to patience and forgiveness, and how does it take courage to be patient, to open our hearts, to be fully present with open hearts, even in the midst of pain, to let go, to release.
Since in this circle the practice of presence, or in the research it's oftentimes referred to as mindfulness, the quality of being attentive and awake, is such a fundamental element. We'd like to give you the assignment that as we continue with this presentation, that you go from your ordinary mode of probably being mindless more than mindful, and that you try and bump your level of presence to an extraordinary level, which means that you'll be holding the intention to pay attention. And this is a practice, and what you'll find as we go along here, that practice will change your brain. As we train our minds, we change our brains, and that's part of the transformation that took place with these men. Harry Truman, these are from a set of slides called the Battle Mind Kit that's currently being used to train the troops. There's this one slide in there, it's from Truman, where he says, leaders must have strong minds ready to accept facts as they are. And it takes a certain courage to be in the midst of our economy and our business and to sit down with the people we need to work things out with and look deeply and clearly at things which aren't necessarily what we want and to work with that. And this quality of mental toughness, of developing the capacity, a strong heart, if you will, could be translated, I think, in this context maybe as mental toughness. Part of this willingness to be present, to have the courage to be awake to our experience, is that we might feel all kinds of emotions that are distressful. And how do we work with those? How do we keep our heart open to our suffering so that we don't create more, so that we can maintain access to our precious human resources that we need at those times? How can we be mindful of the narratives in our minds? You may think all kinds of things. I'm wasting my life here. They don't want us here. No progress is being made. We're never going to keep the product line going, whatever it may be. To be mindful of those internal conversations, because as we're mindful of them, as we monitor them, we can manage them and we can modulate them.
And we can't really take a stand and stand by our hearts or our core values and beliefs if we're not listening and aware of what they are. If we don't know what's true for us, we can't stand up for the truth with the courage that's requested and required of us.
So a practice we could offer to you just as a presence practice, as a practice of courage and to keep the heart open, is just to seed your mind training with these phrases. Clear presence. And to anchor that, just reach up for a moment, touch your heart, just as in the sense of I'm here, I'm connected. Clear presence. And if you want just to ground that or to activate that, there's just a sense of, I'm here, I feel the burn, I see the beauty, I'm present with what's here. Clear presence. Embracing the flow of experience, you can anchor that with the flow of your breathing. The breath comes in, the breath goes out, the thoughts come, the thoughts go. Whatever it is that's on the screen is arising, being seen clearly as it comes and flows. Clear presence. Embracing the flow of experience.
With courage and compassion.
With courage and compassion. And to anchor that sense of courage and compassion, just a little bit of a smile in the heart, just a sense of perspective, Thich Nhat Hanh would sometimes say, after his incredible work being in the firestorm of what was going on in Vietnam, he'd say, we have to learn to smile to our suffering because we're more than our suffering. We need to learn how to smile to our suffering because we're more than our suffering. So clear presence, embracing the whole catastrophe in all its beauty and its pain, with great courage, with great compassion. So as a practice, if you leave here with nothing else, that's a good one. Okay, there's a lot bundled in that. So how did this program come to be? 6 months, full time. These guys pulled no other duty. Some of the elements that were involved was we were still in the midst of the old Cold War mind race. This was the early days of espionage, PSYOPs research. The psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain book had come out, and really there was that sense of, whoa, we'd better keep up with the Russians and the Chinese. So the Mind Reach book talks about the research at Stanford. There were huge projects at many universities, at Princeton, at Stanford. We were doing our own little piece of this at the University of Washington in the Psych Lab. Robert John at Princeton has this amazing book, Margins of Reality, talking about the work that they did trying to influence electronic systems at a distance with their minds and having incredible results with that. So there's this whole environment of probably billions of dollars going into research. So that was going on. In the midst of this, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon pulled a great assignment to go explore the human potential movement for 3 years.
See if there's any value out there.
And to see what he could find to bring back to help them develop an army that would be an earth stewarding force of great agility and resilience and adaptability to meet the needs of the ages to come in the military. So Jim did 3 years of research, put it all into a book with about 126 different practices called Evolutionary Tactics, a manual for the 1st Earth Battalion. And at one point he was called before his generals and his colleagues and a group of community that had come together, and he was given command of a mythical unit within the Army called the 1st Earth Battalion. And
Which he still is.
He still is, and we're part of the gang. So this is from the table of contents for that. You can order it online. Another thing that really gave some valence to the gravity of the situation was many of the people we were working with were Vietnam vets, and they had just released a story that had reported that nearly twice as many men and women committed suicide after they came back from Southeast Asia than died in combat. So imagine standing in front of the Vietnam Memorial and tripling it rather than just one, you'd have 3. And I think with the Iraq War now and the vets coming back from Afghanistan, we've had meetings with people from the Pentagon and the Surgeon General's office. Just how do we deal with this, the fallout of what we have created? So all of these forces really led to us being invited by people in the Pentagon basically saying, we need to do something to equip the next group of warriors to deal with situations that are volatile and uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Sometimes the Army War College is called VUCA University because that's what they deal with. How can we develop a new cadre of troops that are able to find vision in the volatility and understanding within the uncertainty, clarity through complexity, and agility to deal with ambiguous circumstances. So that's basically what gave rise to the invitation to us to design this program. So this is from some of the contractual material, just give you a tone for what our marching orders were. Jedi Warrior was initiated as an experimental training program designed to enhance individual soldier and team abilities. The program was based on a holistic approach to training, and training trainers, and was mandated to make use of emergent human technologies to enhance physiological and psychological awareness and control in Special Forces detachment members. That's a mouthful, but imagine having 6 months to do that. Describing the environment, the modern battlefield is extremely complex, unknown. The men needed to have the ability to adapt and respond and recover to those situations. So our job was to equip them with the skills that they needed to be able to meet those challenges. And the concepts, methods, and material needed to train for optimal human performance were available, and since that time there's so much more science to back up what we've done. It's just a thrill to have so much more data than we did at the time this program happened. And clearly highly applicable to this situation. Military forces will stay on the leading edge of modern warriorship by continuing to develop soldiers who can think clearly, who can act decisively, and who can optimize their physical efforts by drawing upon substantial reserves of psychophysical, emotional, and you could also say spiritual energy. Folks at West Point, we already mentioned. Michael Murphy and George Leonard, two of the real leaders in the human potential movement, were advisors on this project. And at one level, they were very jealous. They said, this is the most intensive human development leadership development program that's been offered in modern times. And they gave us so much support for this. I'm so grateful to them and the many neuroscientists and biofeedback trainers and martial artists and former military people who were advisors on this. Our curriculum was a very integral model. We focused on advanced physical training. You know, in many ways we were shocked because the physical training that these men had up to that point was darn near barbaric. So Larry Burback from here in Seattle was one of our physical trainers and helped design that.
It focused on strength and muscle development, but it didn't include stretching, you know, the warming up parts, a lot of other aspects just of being kind to your body. These guys had injuries that were not really, a lot of them that could have been prevented by knowing how to work their muscles in a more optimal way. So that was part of the program as well.
Our day would usually start at 6 o'clock in the morning on the lawn next to the cemetery. And that's where we do our workouts. And it was so poignant. For 6 months, nobody said a word of the poignancy of that, but it was certainly present in our field of awareness. Michelle and I were involved with the overall design, but facilitation-wise, our main piece was the bio-cybernaut training, which was, you know, what an astronaut is to outer space, a bio-cybernaut is to inner space. So we had a lab with $200,000 worth of biofeedback equipment. We took them on a month-long silent meditation retreat called the Encampment, which we'll get to shortly. We had a blast with them. It was amazing training and to have that kind of intensity. Richard Strozzi Heckler led the Aikido piece of it. Bud Cook, who designed the program with us originally, put a lot of the pieces in place, and then Strozzi did that piece of it. We worked with psychological orientation, issues around death and dying and ethics, and how can we do the things we're being asked to do. We kept them up to date on their mission-related skills, and we worked with their families as well as training them as trainers. The families were actually kind of spooked at the beginning. We had we don't have a lot of photos from those days. I wish we had digital cameras back then.
Well, part of it also was that it was a secret program. It's been since declassified. Yeah. A lot of it was just to protect the visibility of the guys.
But we brought the families together the first night of the program. We said, look, here's the story. We are not going to mess with their minds. We're going to help them discover how they work themselves. We're not going to give them drugs or do a lot of that, but we are going to train them hard, and you're an integral part of this, so stay connected. And just to leap ahead to the data, at the end of the program, though, we had spent $30,000 just gathering data, not processing it, but gathering it. The most meaningful data to us was the reports and the thank yous and the hugs from the guys' wives and girlfriends.
And their kids.
And their kids. It was really moving because they were really showing up at home with a lot of courage, and there was therefore a lot more presence and deeper listening and connection. It's interesting to look at these mission-specific program goals, the ability to remain alert and motionless for long periods of time. We had to design a curriculum for this. To control temperature in the extremities, because they were in a very cold weather environment, so they had to know how to warm their hands and control their physiology. Extended sensory awareness. Acceptance of other cultures, using holistic methods, broaden the theological and spiritual base for the men. So it was a very clearly and explicitly integral design, the inside and the outside. The primary tenet was to increase the awareness of mind-body emotion relationships, leading to greater control over every area of performance, and greater control leading to more appropriate, powerful, and skillful action, all of which would promote winning and survival on the battlefield. So we had two teams to work with. And I'd like to kind of tell a story about the two teams because this has some organizational significance. One team was much more interdirected, connected, well-experienced, well-bonded. The other team was a little bit edgier, more based on authority, less able or willing to recognize potential dangers. They were a little cocky and less open with themselves and each other.
A little?
Okay. The second team also had a captain who looked a little cross-eyed at the program, like, why are we doing this? Plus, he had some major transference issues with our former Marine Colonel team leader. These guys were Army, and yeah, it's like Marine Corps. So that meant a lot of fur would fly on the Aikido mat at times. But it just set up an interesting dynamic, whereas the other team leader, that captain, was there, full on, really encouraging his team. They fully embraced it. And
just one other point on this, from a design element perspective, we had asked for all volunteers because we wanted to optimize the performance and knowing what a big role intention and attitude play. We got all volunteers, and so that's why these two teams who were selected were so differing in their attitudes. But it actually turned out to be very, very full of insights and learnings for us because both of the groups of men had equal capacity and competency. They could have been interchanged with each other as far as their performance of their military skills and their mission. It was the mental side that was where they changed, where they were at variance with each other as far as a lot of it being attitude and how they lined up with the program mentally. So that was very interesting. And we'll show you their brain data.
Yeah. So because of the mirror neuronal circuits in each of our brains, you could say that we interfuse with each other. And our emotional states will be mirrored in other people and trigger responses in them, even if it's below the level of the threshold of their awareness. So even though leaders may say, oh, I leave my feelings at the door, good luck. You know, it's just the vibe is there. And we've seen this time and time again in corporate America and the big organizations that we worked with around the world. A leader will have an epiphany or get off a stuck point someplace in Copenhagen, and things in Silicon Valley change the same day on their team or in their organization. Energy starts to move, which makes me think motor neurons are non-local as well as, mirror neurons are non-local as well as that we're picking up on it in proximity. So there's just a sense that as leaders, we really do need to learn how to manage our own inner energy. I'd like to acknowledge Alex Gray, who's given us his permission to use some of his artwork here. He so well captures this sense of how our energies blend with each other. And understanding mirror neurons and the responsibility we have to manage our personal energy and the impact on our children, our coworkers, our military teams, whoever we're working with. This is such fundamentally important information that we're just in the last 5 years or so starting to be able to articulate how this works. Well, we had a lab with the world's first neurofeedback system that you could hook up a whole team of people to. I mean, you can hook up, in the old days, you could hook up, your brain to a monitor, get feedback on your brainwave states, and learn how to generate brain states that would allow you to have more calm intensity, so to speak.
Which was actually a term that the men that we worked with came up with. They coined that was their goal, to develop calm intensity.
So we developed a system where you could have a whole team of people get feedback on their synchronized brain waves together. It's the world's first system of that sort. The Pentagon said, we don't know what to do. Tell us what you need. And we kind of looked at each other and said, this would be really cool. And it would probably be useful. And so we did both intensive individual training as well as group training.
And part of the thinking in helping these men learn to synchronize their brainwaves with each other was that they worked as a team, and they needed to be able to intuitively tune into each other and be synced up. Their lives depended on it as well as their mission. So there was a very practical purpose, as well as that, it would be interesting to see how this works from our design mode. It was really critical to their success.
So we've got the two teams here. 065 was the one that was not as wholeheartedly engaged in the program, and 062 on the right was the one that really went for it. And then we had 3 data points. One was the initial wave of neurofeedback training, and the different lines are related to brain power in eyes open, eyes closed, vigilant tasks, different kinds of states of being, the brain power in those. And then the second point was about a month later to see where their baselines were at. And then we went into a period of intensive neurofeedback training. That's that last slope there. That was really a period of much more intensive immersion. They do Aikido for half a day and be on the mat training physically and engaging on the outside, and then they'd spend half the day with us in the lab learning the moves on the inside. So they were learning inner moves that they could test on the outside, bring the inside and the outside together. We showed...
One story that comes up on this. One day, just relating to courage and the inner aspects of it as well, we had, in this lab, Joel and I had kind of outside the different rooms, we could monitor what was going on for each of the people who were training. We could, kind of like our alpha central control room. And one day I noticed that one of the men who usually was very disciplined and had really good control over his brainwaves and very focused, and everything looked like the sensors must have fallen off. There was just no coherence. It was all over the place. And I said to Joel, let me just go in, check on Chief. Maybe it's not connected. He might have moved. They were very creative. They would try everything at first physically that they could think of to be successful in producing their alpha waves, until they realized it was more on the inside. But I said, well, maybe he just knocked it off. And I went in, and sure enough, everything was connected fine. And I just said, Chief, what's going on? Anything unusual happening? And he said, I just can't get my brain to work today. And I said, well, why? What's happening? He said, well, and then he shared that he had had this big fight with his wife that morning, and he had to be at the lab, and they didn't have time to work it out, and he was still, it was just like his mind, he wasn't able to manage his mind, and all the anger, and he got to see the effect that kind of anger and emotional being out of control actually showed up in his capacity to focus and to be present. And so I just said, well, would you like to learn or practice? And I taught him some forgiveness meditation. So here the courage and forgiveness really came in. Just a way to connect with with his heart in that moment, and to open it towards himself and to his wife, and he got it, and he just went for it, and he could see how the brain waves became more coherent, synced up. The whole kind of chaos became a beautiful symphony. And he, in such a direct way for himself, more than I could have ever told him about the effect of emotional intelligence, he got to actually learn the effect on his whole being of his capacity to monitor and manage, and that there were practices, there were ways that he could work with opening up and releasing that anger, and being able to see the bigger picture in that moment. And it was very profound for him.
So we showed this data to some of our neuroscientist friends and explained, what it was, and they looked at it and they went, "Wait a minute, was this team on drugs?" Looking at the team with the greatly dampened neurological power collectively, and we said no, they just had an attitude problem going on there. Too many mirror neurons being triggered in the wrong way. Look how this showed up in terms of the performance scales compared between the two teams. Here's some of the team factors. 062 was the one with the strong brains and the strong supportive leadership. And these are changes from baseline. How much have things changed since you came in? Look at the difference between those two teams.
And these were self-report.
These were self-reported and on the basis of observations. It's a composite of 3 different kind of triangulations on the data. Physical enhancements, and mental and emotional differences. So if you think that attitude doesn't play a big role in the performance of people, it telegraphs big time. Yes, sir.
The question is, were these intact teams at the time they joined you, or were they put into teams there?
They were already intact.
They were intact. 065 had been together longer and had really bonded in a different kind of way. 065 was newer and a bunch of hot shots that had a different kind of attitude in a different way, but they were all just phenomenal. These are the best in the Army, and things did shift over time. In fact, there were points 2-3 months into the program where some of the guys came to us as like a coalition and said, "Look, we've just been in your face and screwing around here and wasting time. Do you think
we could do this again?
Could we start over? Maybe we could make the program another couple months longer." And so it was a transformational process
the fact
for
that
us all.
They were intact is what got in the way of getting all volunteers, because they had to stay with their teams. It wasn't a matter of the individuals themselves deciding to be part of it. Yeah.
So just
one more question.
Was this data shared back? Was it used to inform their work? Were they aware of this self-reporting data?
When we did the final debrief, we had that, but we were facilitating the process. We didn't have all of the data to share with them on this piece of it till later in the program. And at that point, we really had learned to have a lot of dialogue together and to work with this, and many of the issues had been resolved to some degree, but it was still in the field, and it was a learning process. We found out afterwards that they had intentionally given us 2 teams with very different dynamics to see how that would play out, but they didn't tell us on the front end. So, just consider, what are your real human resources that are the keys to your success, and that at some level, the only advantage you really have is your collective brain power over your competitors. How are you managing those precious resources? So, just to wrap this piece up, if you want to maximize productivity and get the best results from your staff, then remember, you want people to be in an optimal mind, brain, emotional state. And in order to do that, you really have a piece of that. Everybody has a piece of it that you as a leader should remember to be mindful and to develop the skills that you need to manage yourself effectively. As you came into our lab, you walked down a long hall and you opened the door And then on the wall opposite the door was a big mirror, which is a biofeedback device. It reflects to you information about your body, and using that mirror you can get your eyebrows straight or pull something out of your eye or shave or whatever. It's a biofeedback device. Well, behind the walls here were hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment to teach the men to train, control their blood pressure and their brain waves and their muscle tension and all that. But above the mirror across from the door, it said, "Caution, entering minefield." And if there were any visiting dignitaries on base, they'd always grab them at the airstrap, bring them straight to the lab, and hook them up to the blood pressure biofeedback system, because they were so excited that the guys could actually learn how to control their blood pressure. So the work was to basically develop both the skills and the confidence for these guys. They needed to know how to keep from getting frostbite. They needed to know how to deal with states of extreme boredom and anxiety. They needed to deal with the intensity inside so that their inner enemies didn't disable them before their outer enemies found them and took them out. So, part of the drill was, most of us don't understand how our minds work, and therefore we don't use them very well. And this whole Jedi notion, as we frame it, is there's normal, okay, which is generally fairly unsophisticated with all of this. People are generally stressed and mindless and doing the best they can, and that's normal. And then there's healthy. And healthy is generally feeling good and working more optimally. And then there's extraordinary performance. So when we're talking about Jedi warrior training, we're talking about not being normal anymore, but moving in the direction of greater health and greater extraordinary capability. In terms of the mind, one of the ways we frame this is, look, guys, you've got an active mind. It has intention. It sets direction. It has imagination, which you can use to stress yourself out or to heal yourself. And it allows you to think and to reason. These are tools. Let's learn how to use them. And you have quiet mind skills, more receptive mind skills, such as being present and attentive, being aware of your somatic intelligence and grounded in your body, open to the intuitive intelligence that comes through you when you're really deeply listening. Let's use them all. And then there's a third mental element. This is sort of like hydrogen, helium, and is it lithium? Putting these all together is the attitude that kind of brings those all together, how we hold all these together. So we really trained our guys to be mindful of them all. At West Point, they had developed, and we expanded this model from them, just kind of some of the different dimensions of the mind to work with. Our cognitive foundations, being mindful of our beliefs, values, the principles that guide our life, and the goals that we set, and the intentions we hold. And combining both mastery of attention, our mindfulness, with managing our energy and mastering stress, combining that with visualization and mental imagery to realize states of peak performance. So this is a model that we worked with quite a bit. One example in the lab, this is two of our advisors on the project were Elmer and Elise Green from the Menninger Foundation. At one point, they brought a yogi into the lab who was also an engineer, and they put a thermal sensor here and a thermal sensor here, and they said, Swamiji, see what kind of a difference you could make by redistributing the blood flow to these two areas with your mind. And you can see here over 15 minutes, he made a 17-degree difference. This area was hot to the touch and red. This was almost blanched out up here. And they said, how long did it take you to learn how to do that? He said, 24, 25 years. And they got kind of discouraged. If you could teach a cancer patient how to cut off the blood flow to a tumor, that would be very cool. A student at Kansas State...
Or increase blood flow to an infection.
Or to
Yeah.
warm up those cold toes because your boot's got a hole in it and you're not going to see any heat for a long time. A student at Kansas State University heard about this and went home, got some biofeedback equipment out in his lab and set his mind to it. Guess how long it took him to get the same level of physiological control by creating a feedback loop using the equipment? Longer than 30 minutes. It took him 2 weeks. 2 weeks. So we had 6 months with these guys. And the basic paradigm was teaching people to refine their awareness, to bring it to subtler and deeper levels so that what was previously unconscious was now above the threshold of consciousness. The biofeedback allows us to put a sensor on a signal generator like blood pressure or skin temperature, which is maybe too subtle to be aware of, but when we can boost that signal and bring it up to the level of awareness, then we can consciously create a feedback loop and interact with it and accelerate the acquisition of deeper learning, and in the process bring our awareness to a much deeper, subtler level. And there's a great little poem, maybe repeat this after me just to get a sense for this. It comes from Khyentse Rinpoche. It says, goes like this: the more I listen,
The more I listen,
the more I will hear.
the more I will hear.
The more I hear,
The more I hear,
the more and more deeply I will understand.
more and more deeply I will understand.
The more you listen, the more you will hear. The more you hear, the more and more deeply you will understand. And with these guys, one of the axioms of biocybernetics was control follows awareness. Choice follows awareness. You can only manage what you monitor. So there's a great degree of mastery, but there was a great sense of the vulnerability and the humility in the face of mystery. And this program was really dancing between those two in a very strong way. You could say that every method of mind training produces a different energetic, biochemical, and neurological signature. It's said that the Buddha alone taught 84 million different methods, like 84 million different designer molecules of mind training, each of which would have a different effect, develop a different capacity, would deal with a certain problem that might plague us. So there's a huge amount of technology, inner technology, that's available. In our case, the men had this wonderful laboratory to test what they were learning on the inside, on the outside, on the Aikido mat. So they trained intensively there. Aikido is a martial art form very familiar to people in this community, developed by Ushiba Sensei, and he reminds us that the art of peace begins with you. Work on yourself, your appointed task in the art of peace. Everybody has a spirit that can be refined, a body that can be trained in some manner, a suitable path to follow. You're here for no other purpose than to realize your inner divinity and to manifest your enlightenment. Foster that peace in your life, and then apply that art to all that you encounter. So really through the Aikido, through the meditation retreat, through the deep listening, through the collegial deepening, there was a lot of deep spirit in this program. And it was very honoring of each of the guys and where they were coming from. But one of the things they really got to learn on the mat was a lot about applied complexity theory. That when an open system moves towards complexity, when an open system, a connected system, a resonant system moves towards complexity, in such an attuned and resonant state, they are most stable, flexible, and adaptive. And though this kind of martial art training was totally foreign to them, they were used to breaking and hurting things and people. And Aikido is about learning to read energy and blend and immobilize and
redirect.
To take down as necessary, but it was a completely different somatic paradigm for them, let alone psychological and spiritual. So they really learned a lot about applied chaos theory on that.
And
Part
they
of
took good care of Joel.
They took really good care of me. I was so out of my league with these guys. But part of the deal was I'd show up on the mat with them, and they'd show up in the lab with us. And they really respected both of us for being willing to show up there. They knew we were somewhat strange birds in their cage. But they also realized that what they were learning from us was likely to save their life or their mission, and some of them realized their marriage, perhaps, someday. So it was a good thing. So these were guys.
We were just coming into the encampment. Joel had mentioned earlier the meditation retreat. This program included a 1-month silent retreat away from the base, but we didn't call it a retreat, given the context. We called it an encampment. So we're coming in to just describe a bit to you about the training, the discipline, the protocols that really, for many of these guys, showed them areas to develop their courage that they hadn't been aware of, yet they were areas they needed to if they were going to be dropped in and alone by themselves in enemy territory, in a trench, potentially doing recon, surveillance. They needed to be able to be with their own minds, and they were afraid that they might go crazy if they did. And so this was an opportunity for them to practice in that silence, being with their own minds, which for many of them was the first time they had formal training and support to do that, and to recognize and befriend their inner enemies and transform their relationship to whatever might be arising in their mind, to stay open-hearted to the pain that might be there, memories, whatever would come up. So this is a picture of where we were, actually a Boy Scout camp.
It was a Boy Scout camp in southern New Hampshire in the autumn. It was a gorgeous place to do a retreat. And for many of the guys, this was the scariest mission they were ever sent out on. No talking, intensive meditation training for about 16 hours a day, no breaks, basically. It was, imagine sitting down to eat a meal and doing it in silence, challenging yourself to actually taste every bite and to swallow it and then feel the arising of desire for the next bite. Imagine having no distractions, no reading, no television, no internet, no conversation, and just being mindful of the breath coming in and the breath going out, and the breath coming in and the little pause, and the breath going out and a little pause for 8, 10, 12, 15 hours a day, really letting the graphite of the kind of incoherent mind come into a more coherent diamond-like state, where this quality of calm intensity and unshakable presence and fearless, courageous heartfulness was online rather than just flickering like a 10-watt light bulb, online like a 10-watt laser beam through the kind of training that we did.
They had courage in physical arenas, like jumping out of airplanes. They were all trained to parachute as parachuters, rangers. They would free fall out of their planes and not open their chutes till they were pretty close to the ground. They knew how to do that. But this is a whole other area which was new terrain for them. And they did pretty well, actually.
So we're about 3 weeks into the retreat, and I give a talk on whole systems theory one night. How everything's interconnected and interfused, and like the keynote this morning, inviting us into this sense of, like Muir says, if you pull on anything, you'll find it's hitched to the whole universe. And at the end of that talk, one of the guys raised his hand, and you could just feel the cognitive dissonance that was there as he was trying to wrap his head around this. And he says, Joel, let me get this straight. If what you're saying is really true,
about how everything is interconnected,
how could we ever kill anybody? And there was this huge silence. And this big door had been opened to a very courageous conversation that went on late into the night and led to many more questions. So it was, as my grandpa would say, this was deep work, son, you know. So the more we listen, the more we'll hear. Here we're out on a beach. We were doing Aikido training during the retreat. This was a day when we had buried a cast iron pot in the sand, and they were dowsing for it, trying to develop, you know, their extra sensory capacity to find the pot. Here in particular, they're doing an exercise where they were holding their hands over the back of a person, either high or low, and the person would need to sense and feel the energy of the hand behind them and say high, middle, or low. And these guys were actually amazing. They had, at one level, they had instincts like hunting dogs. And we did a lot of work with them around energy medicine and rolfing and deep tissue work. And the medics in particular were so grateful because they finally started getting skill sets of easy to apply methods in the field that they didn't have to carry a bunch of technology for. At the end of the retreat, one of the team leaders said, I thought I was operating at 90 or 95% optimal performance, but I realize now I may not have even been operating at 50. This really widened my scope of looking at things. Finally, I learned much about the attitude of my teammates and their personal codes of discipline. At the end of the retreat, we went into a cycle for the last week or so where we would hike all day. We'd do mindful walking with them with packs that were 60 to 80 to 90 pounds heavy. And we'd hike for 45 minutes mindfully in silence, and then we'd sit and meditate for 20, hike, sit, sit, all day long. We'd come back after dark. At the end of the encampment, they were dropped into an orienteering course, you know, dropped out of a plane in the middle of the night, really rough territory, a grueling course where if they didn't get to checkpoints on time, they didn't get food, and didn't know how many legs there were, and it was just horrendous, terrain, difficult. No teams of special forces had ever successfully completed the course. They had all gotten either too dangerous to be together from the stress, or they had physically broken down, had to be pulled off of the course. Both of our teams made it through. And at the end of the whole course, at the end of the 6 months, one of the two teams was selected as the most outstanding team in the NATO games that year. So, teach them courage, forgiveness, patience, fearlessness, compassion. I'll let you guess.
Yeah. 62.
Okay, just a little bit of the science behind this briefly, this whole notion that as we train our minds, we change our brains. You could say that, you know, we've got the best of technical equipment on the outside, but we're still running old software on the inside. And how can we, you know, where can we get the downloads on this? So this is really a great model that we've developed to try and explain this to people. You know, we have our lived experience. And that lived experience gives a certain worldview and beliefs and an identity. And depending on what that identity and worldviews are, then we have what we value and care about. And what we value determines what we invest our attention to, what we pay attention to. And what we pay attention to activates certain neuronal circuits in the brain, and the more we activate them, the more they grow, and the neurons hook up with each other and build more robust connections, and energy and information flows through them, so that by paying attention, we shape our brains. We rewire our brains. And then that sets certain filters of perception and biases that, lets energy flow more easily in certain ways, and that reinforces our pattern of lived experience, and round it goes. So just this notion that through mental training, it's not just a head trip. We're literally changing our brains.
And
it's very powerful.
In the same spirit of connections, one of the older soldiers who had some injuries, we spoke with him after that orienteering, that gut check, as they called it, and we asked him, so what helped you get through that? How did you make it? You know, what resources did you rely upon? And he said, you know that, he was referring to a meditation practice where you connect with your own suffering, and then you realize, oh, others may have this suffering too, and you send kind of that wish or the energy, may you be free from pain, may you be free from suffering, may you get what you're looking for. I started doing that, you know, I was like having such a hard time. I realized the guys behind me were struggling, and I reached out, you know, a sense of building that neuronal connection that actually gave more energy to him. I just, oh, may you make it up this hill, may you get through. And doing this kind of a practice that's traditionally called a loving kindness practice. So bringing that heart that reaches out to each other actually brought more energy and optimal performance to the person in this very difficult, challenging, grueling task.
So on this model, there's the old observe, reflect, have an insight or an aha that changes action and behavior. What happens is that neurologically, where we're really able to change behavior is when we have an insight that leads us to then set an intention or make a commitment or devote ourselves in some kind of way. We're really adamant about setting that intention. That's what's really going to shift the behavior patterns, is when people make that kind of commitment. And this is very profound and worthy of our attention. It's not just about having a great experience, it's about being moved to do something. So there's this phenomenal study in the Proceedings in National Academy of Science a number of years ago, looking at a group of trained meditators who had trained for, on the bottom chart here, going up the diagonal for 15,000 hours of meditation practice, 30,000, 45,000. And what you can see here is that the effects on their scores and the degree to which their brain was functioning different was positively correlated with the amount of training they had. On the top, what you see is on the left is the high amplitude, high synchrony, coherent brain function of the experienced meditators as compared to a control group of people who had just been practicing this mind training technique for 1 week. And I just wanted to put this up in the sense of just appreciate that basically we can grow a new operating system. But we have to apply ourselves to it. Google will not let you download this. Microsoft does not put this in a box, but you carry it in your cranium and can activate this through your commitment, through looking out through your eyes and knowing you are seeing and smiling to yourself and go, yes, I'm awake, and cultivating that quality more fully. In this one, again, you see the difference, the practitioner scores on the top there as compared to the controls, like a completely different species of being. So in a sense, these are Jedi warriors who have devoted themselves to intensive training and transforming themselves. The key factor here is mindfulness, to be awake to what we're noticing, what we're feeling and thinking. And in that bag over there, we have some little stickers of this just as an artifact from today. You know, put it on your monitor or something. When we worked at HP, the biggest division in HP was one of our main clients for about 5 or 6 years. One of their core values for the whole division was mindfulness. And we took this in every way. Mindfulness for us as individuals, being aware of what our current reality is, and mindfulness of our collective.
Actually, when we came out of the Army project and we were telling many of the folks in business and the business leaders that we worked with about the project, there was this immediate resonance, and the leaders said, that's what we need. We need an ultimate warrior training program. We're living on a battlefield, working in a war zone. Bombs are dropping every day. You know, can you help us have at least a mini version of this kind of training program? And that led to a whole field of applications of the work of the Army into the business world.
So the business case is basically increase the capacity of people to grow their brains, to develop their capacity to be fully present, to have the courage to show up for reality and meet each other there. Enhance awareness of the realities and possibilities and options that are there. Help people to have a chance of making wiser decisions based on a deeper wisdom. And you'll get improved results and resilience and confidence. Just basically, this is the composite, keeping in mind we had 2 different teams. This is the kind of data we got coming out of the program, putting both of the teams together. And you'll see, overall it was just pretty mind-blowing. And this data is in your slides. I think with time, we'll go. Successful completion of Trojan Warrior was Jedi Warrior has placed the Army at the forefront of human performance technology development. By validating in a controlled, measured manner the holistic approach of mind, body, team training, the Army has demonstrated its commitment to providing soldiers with the very best training that's available. You could say that for ordinary, untrained people that this causal loop is very much in play. I showed this at one point. A woman said, wow, that sure describes our team. That our confusion leads to doubt and mistrust, that drives our lethargy and depression, that reinforces our distraction and reactivity, and leads us to be even more inattentive, and on it goes. What these guys learned at the end of the program, we had a fellow from National Academy of Science come to visit, and he looked around and said, how do you justify this? All this technology, all this time. I described the mission of these guys, and I said, if you were going to go out on their mission, wouldn't you want to know that you'd be able to keep your own heart from exploding and manage your energy and keep your limbs warm and befriend your inner enemies and stop the war inside? And he said, yeah. I said, well, basically, all of this training and technology has been to teach them one thing. He said, what's that? I said, confidence. That if they have confidence, they can channel their energy and passion in a focused way, paying attention, getting insights that build our confidence, our self-mastery, and our capacity. So I think I'd like to pause here. We have really a dear colleague here in the audience that we've asked to come and just share a few reflections before we go into some table dialogue here of how some of this work is translated. We've taken this work into hundreds of organizations that have said, look, we need a Jedi Warrior program here. People are getting hurt. There's a lot of chaos and intensity. We want to be successful with our missions. David Marsing and we worked together at Intel for years on projects that went across all the leadership for the whole of Intel in the States, in Europe. And he's had his own little Jedi Warrior training program. And we'd like to invite David to share a few reflections with us before we go into some table dialogue here. Just to ground this in the realm of his own experience. Thank you.
I just got to say it's an honor to be invited to even be on the stage with these two, because these two have uniquely affected my life and my family's life and the lives of, I think, tens of thousands of other families, which is a remarkable impact in just a very kind way. My personal story is an interesting one. I, like many people you may know or have to do consultancy for, who are pretty messed up, pretty driven, like overamped, A-type, goal-oriented, insecure, basket cases. And I certainly was a poster child for somebody who was extremely competitive, somebody who was very goal-oriented, somebody who just go, 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 go. There was, I figured I'd sleep when I died. And I almost did. I created a field in the environment that I was in factory operations that actually ended up inducing not only stress for myself, but I realized later stress for lots of other people. In fact, I amplified a field that was already almost intolerable to the point that it was deadly. And the way it affected me was I had a heart attack and I died in Albuquerque doing one of these projects. And I was fortunate enough to like reconnect my body and my spirit and my brain. And then fortunately I had a cardiologist and a cardiac surgeon and an insurance company who forced me into a 3-month retreat. And with making a decision of how I was going to change my life in order to stay alive. What I did during that period of time was I began to realize very quickly that I had, in fact, amplified a field that looked at people, not as people, but as problems that had to be managed. That they were people who were prone to have errors, to do things inaccurately, uncontrollably, and as a mechanical device, these mechanical things needed to be controlled, needed to be commanded very carefully. As I thought about that, I realized that, and actually almost went through a nervous breakdown, realizing the amount of stress I was creating for so many people, and how many people were on the same path I was on, physically, emotionally, psychologically, relationally with their families. And I reached a kind of realization that, there's such a big field in these environments, particularly in a company like Intel, that the results are going to happen. You could almost be catatonic in the results are still going to happen. You've got shareholders, you've got customers, you've got suppliers. I mean, this field is incredible. So I took a step back and I said, what would it take to recognize that there are humans in here that have tremendous potential? And what would it take in this field to create an environment that didn't have stress? And I figured you had to prove this 3 ways. You had to prove it in an existing operation, you had to prove it in a new operation, and you had to prove it in an operation that was winding itself down. So sort of many different phases of the life cycle of an organization. And we had the opportunity during this reflective phase, I met Joel and Michelle, who just happened to be in the Northeast for a conference, and I was from Albuquerque at the time, and I asked them, do you know anybody who can help me in developing my contemplative, capabilities? And Joel very, kind of smiles and reaches into his bag and pulls out this book by a Tibetan that happened to be living 50 miles from me. So I think about this and I say, here I go to the Northeast to meet a couple from Seattle who tell me about a guy who can help me who lives 50 miles from me. All right, start paying attention here. This individual gave me some incredible tools to think about first how to work on myself, to take this question that I was reflecting on and how to really deepen it. How to deepen it in the context of my own personal practices, but in the impact I was having on other people. And to shift what the field I was creating with other people to one that enabled them to show up, enable them to be calm, enable them to invite them to really come and fulfill their potential. And it'll make a long story short, what we did was we almost had an experiment like the 2 teams. We had 2 factories. We had one factory that did it the old-fashioned way, which is go, 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 command control, every decision made from the top for a 2,000, 3,000 person organization. And then we had our group.
With attention leadership and attention mastery.
Very focused. What we created, though, was a group, basically a community, that ended up creating almost on an annual basis a $2 billion revenue difference between the 2 factories. Same equipment, same technology, same organization structure, same processes. One was in Phoenix, one was in New Mexico. How could they be so different? One had people in it, one had people who were being treated like machines. We had a community that could think, that could feel, that took care of themselves, that took care of their families. And the results were just off the chart. But it took my going through a pretty significant transformation and understanding myself to realize the capability and the commitment I had to really hold of making that field exist.
Perfect.
And I want to thank them for their help because they really helped set the category. And there's other stories, that they helped us with, but I just thought I'd share that one. Thanks.
Thanks, David. It's great.
Okay, time flies when you're talking about deep subjects. Just pause for a moment. Again, just look into your own heart. Find the flow of your own breath. Return to that state of clear presence. Embracing the flow of experience, all the reverberations of what we've shared together here today. With courage, with compassion, clear presence, embracing the flow of experience with great courage, with great compassion. Ask the question.
So as we bring this to a close, just again a moment to pause and reflect. If you were to take to heart some of these principles and practices that we've explored this morning, just consider what would be some implications or applications for your organization, for you personally, that you could envision or sense into at this time. And perhaps instead of doing it at the tables right now, we'll just get a sampling.
Yeah, just get some samplings from the audience. David, maybe could you run this other mic too? And yeah, raise your hand if there's just any reflections you'd like to share or a question. If you were to take any of this to heart, how might that show up for you in your own life or your organization?
I want to thank you for this today. It's perhaps emboldening me. There's one particular CEO that I'm working with that we started out with dealing with his capacity to hear, to listen, to hear, and we've moved to insights about presence. And I'm just toying here with the idea of how to invite him deeper into that conversation and invite his team into that conversation. And I'm not quite sure how to frame that yet, but I'm excited and open to the possibility to just be way more direct about it. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Over here.
I also want to thank you, and I want to close the loop on my original question about holding both of those dilemmas, and about holding both of those dilemmas around the mission readiness, and that they were not either or. They were, in your situation, it was done in the whole interest. And so in the 20 years between the project that I experienced in the military and the one that you experienced, really gives me hope that even in these cultures in these situations where there's a deeply ingrained culture, that there can be growth and learning. This is very, very hopeful. This is different from going into a civilian organization. This has gone into a very strong culture, and I just really commend you on the breadth of what you've done and what you presented here.
We have found that this work is universally applicable to anybody who has a mind, a body, or exists within a field of complex relationships.
And if you can get access to them, you can do your work. Getting access.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Over here. You're surrounded.
Just from a business standpoint, it
Yes.
changes, and I appreciate the work you've done. I hope that the U.S. military is continuing to leverage and train folks in this manner. But from a business standpoint, it moves the thought from human capital to human capacity.
Nice.
You know, Richard Wagner from University of Wisconsin did some work on our follow-up programs after the Army with corporate clients. He said he had looked at 20,000 different subjects in his studies, and he had never seen
change.
Like change programs and organizations. 20,000 subjects. He had never seen any changes in risk-taking or the locus of control. And he looked at programs we did at Travelers, at HP, and at Group Health HMO here in Seattle. On all of them, not only was there a shift in the locus of control, that people literally felt more in control of how they responded to the circumstances of their life and in risk-taking, But those measures actually grew stronger over time, which meant so much to us, just to see that the changes were ongoing in that kind of way. So, yes, back here.
One more, I think.
When I read Richard Stosey Heckler's first book, one of the things he said that was a daunting problem was getting the Green Berets to be in silence and to go through a meditation program. And he said it was a failure because they started to feel that it was mind control, that he was a communist agent, and they got paranoid, and they had to suspend, if I remember correctly, the program. So you obviously frame this in a different way to make this process less threatening, and I wondered if you could share with us how you did that.
I think just to point out that what we're cultivating are qualities that we already have, that we're already paying attention. Could we do that better? We're already having intentions. Could we be more purposeful about those intentions? We're already imagining things and thinking things. Can we learn how to do that in a more disciplined and intentional kind of way? And creating the context design in which this work takes place, what you call it in your organization. We've found that describing this work like mind fitness and change resilience and high performance teamwork, and developing a healthy, high-performing culture. How you describe it, how you set it, how you manage the space, how you pay attention to the feedback and reverberations that are in the field. It's a mysterious art form, but we learn as we go.
And I'd recommend you read Strozzi's new edition of the book, because he wasn't really part of the meditation retreat. He did the Aikido element. So I think there's more clarification around that in the second edition.
So there was something that you showed us that I think answers your question. And that was when you got on the mat with them and did Aikido with them. Because it's all about trust. And it wasn't you telling them, you were putting yourselves on the line like they were. And so there's an element of trust that I think is the real kernel behind that you don't have to talk about. Mm-hmm. But when you express it, especially that physically, that in my mind, if I had been there with you, that would have deepened my trust in you folks, training me than anything else.
Good point. That was a critical factor, yes.
So as we prepare to wrap this up, we're happy to stick around, and if there's other questions. Also, there's a few slides we put in, that are just some models and some elements that weren't in the data set. If you'd like us to send in a couple websites with some more of these methods more explicit, if you'd like to slip us a card, we'll send you a follow-up on that. Also, if somebody would like to grab a table in the lunchroom and catch us as we come through, we're happy to continue the conversation over lunch. But this notion of, as we're prepared to leave this room and go off into the training realm of the rest of our life, what are the ways that you might more courageously show up in your dojo? Okay? What are some of the ways that you might just be more visibly, energetically, heartfully present and say, I'm here with you, and it takes some guts to do this. Just to look for that. And just to pay respect for what it is that we've shared here, I'd like to just invite you one more moment of reflection, if you will. And that's just to pause and look into your heart, or touch your heart if you like, and to just feel what is alive and true and life-affirming within you, having been here in this room and shared this experience and shared this conference. And then to let a wave of gratitude flow from your heart to the people at your tables and your colleagues and coworkers that are here sharing this with you. A wave of respect and powerful heartfulness that reaches out to all of us people in this room for caring as deeply as they do about how they show up in their world and with the people whose lives they touch. And then just to play this as forward as you can from your heart, to let a neutrino bomb of blessings and inspiration and strength radiate from your heart. Just to let that powerful heartedness of deep courage and compassion radiate out as a wave of inspiration to all the beings out there who are seeking for greater courage in their life, to ride the big waves of change we're in the midst of, to find greater confidence and peace and strength and faith and connection. So that there's a sense of significance that what we've done here in this room with maybe a couple hundred people ripples out through this whole community and through all of your clients and your families, and that there are literally billions of other people here in this room with us, somehow connected to what we've shared today. So in that way, I'd just like to say thank you.
Thanks,
and
Peter.
may the force be with you.
Thank you.
To introduce somebody that I've known for about 10 years. I can't believe it's been that long, but we just figured it out, and that's how long it's been. Dr. Tom Johnson was introduced to me by Bill Bellows when he worked at the Boeing Company, and we created a conference called the Into In Thinking Conference that we have once a year down in Southern California. And Bill had known Tom Johnson for some time before Tom came to speak at our conference, and met him, I believe, at one of Dr. Deming's 4-day seminars before he passed away. Mm-hmm. And I'm so happy that we have Tom here today, and that I have an opportunity to introduce him to you. He's going to talk to us about his work at Toyota, and the title of his presentation today is Managing for Life, Lessons from Toyota for Creating Sustainable Businesses. Join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Johnson.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you very much, Beth. I appreciate that. It's good to be here again at System Thinking in Action Conference, another group that I've circled around with for many, many years. I guess from about, I think it was the second one of these conferences that I first attended. Are we in the 20th or is it the 25th? I forget. Oh, this is 19. 20 is next year. Okay. Well, I must have been about 18 years ago, which is about right. About the time shortly after the time I'd come out to Portland State University, where I teach in the School of Business still. For about the past 15 years, I've told audiences a story. Some of you might have heard it in various guises. One version of it is published in the second Fifth Discipline Field Book, which is at least 10 years ago, I think. And that version of the story has been modified many times. But it's a story about changes since the 1960s in my perception of what determines good business performance. Now, starting as a professional accountant and then shifting to the academic world to study and teach economics and management accounting, I saw business for almost the first 30 years of my career through the lens of financial information that was embodied in market prices, accounting statements, and cost reports. Then, just about 20 years ago, a chance introduction to Toyota's operations, largely at Georgetown, Kentucky, shook my long-standing belief that the surest pathway to superior business performance was improved financial information in forms such as activity-based costing, balanced scorecards, and performance budgets. I came to see that Toyota's unrivaled performance resulted primarily from its unique way of organizing relationships among people in the workplace, not from driving people's work with financial targets. About the same time that I was discovering Toyota, I also was exploring modern science, especially life sciences and astrophysical cosmology, and looking at writers who saw in recent scientific discoveries lessons for business. Now, from this study, I surmised that Toyota's way of organizing work succeeded so brilliantly because it resembled nature's way of organizing life on Earth as science explained it. In that context, I began to examine Toyota's practices to see if they might be a template that could show businesses how to achieve robust sustainability, analogous to the sustainability that nature's living systems have achieved on Earth for over 4 billion years. Now, in the wake of the recent global economic crisis, accompanied by Toyota's first financial losses in 50 years, people ask me if I still see Toyota as a model for other organizations to follow. My answer is that Toyota, as it was before the early 2000s, certainly still serves as an exemplary model to follow. The company's present financial problems arose just recently when a few top managers brought unfortunate changes to the thinking that had shaped Toyota's stunningly successful practices in the previous 4 decades. Now, in place of the living system thinking that always had guided the company's practices, those managers shifted attention to the mechanistic thinking held by the global financial community and by virtually all other large corporations in the world since the 1970s. In short, Toyota's current crisis occurred because a few of the company's top managers turned away from considerations that had always anchored Toyota's operations to the concrete reality of living systems. Instead, they concentrated on the virtual reality of financial abstractions that had guided almost all other large corporations in the world for the past 30 years or so. Indeed, it is the primacy that large corporations and financial institutions give to the virtual reality of financial abstractions and their relative indifference to the concrete reality of human and non-human life that helped produce the recent worldwide financial crisis. I believe this explains why Toyota's financial performance turned south so sharply in the current recession. The severity of this current recession would probably not have caused Toyota's present predicament had it not been that its top managers capitulated for the first time to the global financial system's mandates that long shaped behavior in the rest of the corporate world. After all, in recessions preceding this current crisis, Toyota passed through unscathed back into the early 1960s, while its competitors usually suffered severe losses in previous recessions. Toyota's current performance has declined because it abandoned its unique management thinking, which reflected living systems, and for a brief moment it adopted the devotion to financial abstractions that dominates virtually all large corporations in the world. Now, this account of Toyota's recent downturn was insisted upon in February of this year, of 2009, by Shoichiro Toyota, the 84-year-old family patriarch and honorary chairman of the Toyota Motor Company. When he announced a stunning shakeup of top management in February, he excoriated top managers for losing sight of the fundamentals that had made the company so outstanding. He pointed out that the company's financial reversal occurred not primarily because of the recession's severity, but because after 2000, its top executives, in order to achieve excessive finance-driven growth and pricing, sacrificed the fundamentals that had made Toyota thrive for so long. Mr. Toyota promised that the company would, as he said, return to basics. Now, these fundamentals, the basics, are not well understood by Western management observers who mistakenly attribute Toyota's success to a set of practices labeled lean management. Lean is not a term Toyota uses to describe the management approach it has developed in the last 40 to 50 years. Perhaps as close as Toyota ever came to a catch-all phrase for its approach is just in time, although just in time, or JIT, describes only a particular aspect of their management approach, not the approach in its entirety. Proponents of lean management, however, do claim that lean encompasses Toyota's whole approach. Invented by those outside Toyota, the term lean was first used by outsiders in the 1980s to describe unique practices they saw in Toyota plants, such as Kanban, Jidoka, Andon signaling, Heijunka, tact time, Kaizen, and much more. Outsiders from the West who saw these practices as the key to Toyota's distinctiveness did not realize that people working in Toyota view such practices as temporary solutions or countermeasures that were devised as remedies for particular problems that kept Toyota from achieving an ideal operating condition that the company sometimes refers to as true north. More basic in Toyota than those specific countermeasures is the company's distinctive way of thinking that drives it constantly to pursue an ideal state, its true north, and to develop those unique practices as solutions to problems along the way. This approach to management is now fully described for the first time, really, in a new book entitled Toyota Kata, K-A-T-A, written by Mike Rother, co-author of the book Learning to See, published in, I think it was 1999. Many of you may be familiar with. Now, in general, that thinking that permeates the Toyota organization focuses the company's workers and managers on generating and continually improving a carefully orchestrated system that is capable of producing results sufficient to sustain the organization's ongoing activities indefinitely. By comparison, companies other than Toyota tend to focus attention on forcing everyone in the company to achieve the highest possible short-run results targets set for the most part by global financial markets. These other companies tend to view results as an additive linear sum of independent contributions from a mechanistic collection of parts. The big difference here is that Toyota always viewed results as emerging from a complex nonlinear process in which people patiently nurture a web of relationships that emulates behavior in natural living systems. In short, Toyota's management culture at its zenith was process-driven, not results-driven. Toyota eschewed the financial market's absurdly impossible demand to produce higher results quarter by quarter. Its own pathway to higher results echoed W. Edwards Deming's advice given many years ago to improve the capability of processes, not to demand that people meet higher targets by any means possible. Toyota's attention to process and the thinking it generated led to the company's many decades of remarkable financial performance. Now today, as I've just pointed out, we've come to understand better than ever the cause of Toyota's greatness and now of its present decline. Ironically, we may have achieved this insight in the context of a global financial system that is hostile to the financial health of Toyota or any other company. If nothing stops global financial institutions from their relentless drive for immediate short-run returns, if the financial sector completes its takeover of the global economy that it has worked toward for the past 30 years, then knowing that emulating nature's systems will improve long-run business performance cannot rescue non-financial businesses. The harsh reality is that today's large global financial institutions are scarcely interested in the performance of any large non-financial company. Global financial institutions are not interested in the discovery that a company's managers might improve their company's financial performance by replacing mechanistic managed by results thinking with Toyota's living system style of management by means thinking. Global financial institutions are not concerned to build businesses and to improve business performance. On the contrary, their sole concern is to maximize as quickly as possible the returns they can generate for their own individual benefit through destructive financial transactions that strip a business of its entire value and leave it bankrupt, if not worse. The aim of these institutions is to capture for themselves all the wealth they can generate, especially by using debt to gain control of a business and then selling it or its pieces for as much as possible in global financial markets. In short, the large financial institutions, the Wall Street institutions particularly, have learned that destroying makes them more money than building, and they are very good at it. Now, I once believed that corporate management's goal should be to nurture a profitable enterprise that sustained good-paying jobs by providing useful products and services to its customers. I saw the fundamental cause of poor business performance to be the power of accounting and finance to focus managers' attention on immediate growth in bottom-line financial results, such as profit, return on investment, and shareholder value. Higher and more stable average financial results are achieved, I thought, when managers concentrate on perfecting the concrete, real human features of a business, as Toyota always did until very recently, rather than concentrate merely on achieving abstract financial targets. But my belief did not take into account the nature and power and impact of today's global financial institutions. It troubles me deeply to have been forced to conclude that global financial institutions have themselves become an insidious threat to the well-being of businesses, a threat that overwhelms and trivializes the dangers posed by the long-term losses companies incur when managers misguidedly pursue short-term financial targets, neglecting a company's processes and relationships. Today's global financial institutions seek to gain far more than the returns that even the best performing non-financial business can produce. The object of today's global financial institutions is not simply to profit from trading securities and arranging financing for profit-oriented businesses that strive to provide useful products and services that meet real human needs, while at the same time providing employees with decent livelihoods. No. Not at all. Today's financial industry seeks to deal with people, resources, and businesses as commodities to be traded in the least regulated and least transparent markets possible in order to make as much money for themselves as possible, whatever the cost to society as a whole. Now, this system works to the great benefit of traders, especially in the global financial institutions that have access to deposit banking subsidiaries. These subsidiaries enable them to borrow money, creating enormous debt at virtually no cost and with almost all risk transferred to taxpayers. For 50 years under the Glass-Steagall Act, large financial institutions that engaged in corporate underwriting and securities trading were prohibited from owning and controlling commercial deposit banks. Because that act was repealed, however, in 1999, these institutions can once again own deposit banks as they last did in the speculative 1920s. These global financial institutions, with their immense powers, exert tremendous pressure on corporate management to pay attention to results compiled by accountants and financial analysts. This pressure caused most companies outside Toyota to become obsessed after the 1970s with achieving only short-term financial targets. and virtually to disregard the relationships that create a healthy and profitable organization for the very long term. Because global institutions and global financial markets in effect compelled management to adopt as its primary role the relentless pursuit of short-run financial targets, therefore companies disregarded the concrete reality of customers, employees, communities, and nature, and instead focused only on the virtual reality of financial results. And so here we stand today. Now, this misplaced concreteness, borrowing that phrase from the late Alfred North Whitehead, this misplaced concreteness that substitutes abstract financial transacting for the concreteness of company processes and systems happened in large part because large global financial institutions can grow their assets in a virtual economy at a much faster pace than non-financial business institutions are able to do in the real economy. The term virtual economy here refers to an economy in which the chief economic pursuit is to invest in and trade in financial instruments. As this economy becomes more and more focused on finance, monetary wealth is concentrated more and more in the hands of a few, and the industrial capacity of the nation is hollowed out. We see this increasingly in the United States, where productive industries have disappeared at an alarming rate. And yet human beings cannot survive without a real economy, where manufacturing and other forms of non-financial business are ubiquitous. Now, the enormous size of financial institutions now gives them, and the financial markets they control, increasing power to force businesses in the real economy, businesses, in other words, that could provide real jobs for real people, to capitulate to their demands for short-term earnings growth and share price appreciation. Global financial institutions, with their self-created debt, have almost unlimited power to purchase control of non-financial businesses and drive their managers toward decisions that maximize the financial traders' short-run returns. This power virtually ensures that efforts to improve business performance by improving management practice are doomed. Optimizing the system of relationships by which a business contributes to the community's economic well-being eludes the grasp now of most non-financial businesses. They are becoming mere pawns in a virtual economic system that is controlled by and for the benefit of giant financial institutions. In this setting, it seems futile for a business to improve its performance by struggling to emulate practices observed in a company like Toyota. The very recent slide toward bankruptcy of the Simmons Bedding Company, makers of the Simmons mattresses, until now a successful manufacturing firm in the United States for 133 years, illustrates exactly how large financial institutions profit by destroying non-financial companies, companies that they treat as pawns on a virtual economic playing field that they control. Like thousands of American companies, Simmons is the victim of corporate buyout schemes. These schemes began almost 40 years ago with conglomeration, followed by the growth of an increasingly sophisticated takeover market that featured hostile takeovers, then leveraged buyouts, and most recently, private equity and hedge funds. Details change from decade to decade, but the general pattern has been much the same over these years. First, a large investment firm, the investor, generally a financial company with access to very big lines of credit, approaches a target company considered to be undervalued by the market. With the consent of the target company, if possible, or against its wishes if consent is not forthcoming, the investor uses borrowed funds to purchase shares sufficient to gain control over the target company's operations. Having achieved control, the investor then arranges a public equity offering or else uses the target company's assets to increase its debt. In either case, the large investment firm raises enough capital to pay off its original loans, to pay itself various fees, and on occasion to pay itself a special dividend. At that point, the investor firm has recouped its original funds and has obtained, usually, a very, very substantial capital gain. The next step is to boost the target company's value by increasing its earnings as quickly as possible, by whatever means possible. This done, it's time to sell the target company to another investor ready to profit through the same ritual until the target company's debt is no longer sustainable and it is driven into bankruptcy. At Simmons, this process began in the 1970s with its acquisition by two large conglomerates, Gulf and Western being the best known. The process continued in the 1980s when William E. Simon's leveraged buyout firm, Westray Capital, purchased and sold Simmons. Bill Simon was a Secretary of the Treasury in the Nixon administration. Now, finally, after the sale by Simon's firm, Simmons has been flipped 7 times in the last 2 decades. The term flipped is popular in the media today. Bought and sold, bought and sold. It's been flipped 7 times in the last 2 decades since Simon left the scene. It's been bought and sold by firms such as Merrill Lynch, Thomas H. Lee Partners, and many others. The debt piled onto Simmons by these investors rose from $164 million in 1991 to $1.3 billion today, a burden the company can no longer sustain and that now drives it toward bankruptcy. The only winners in this process are members of the investment firms, such as Bill Simon's, the large financial institutions, guess whose names we're talking about here, the big 5 now, government, like J.P. Morgan and Chase and Citibank and so on. The winners in the process are the investment firms and then the large financial institutions that help the investment firms raise capital, and on occasion, top executives, even of the target firms who negotiate with the investors, can be winners. Everyone else loses, including employees, the target company's creditors, often its stockholders, customers, and the communities in which the target companies operate. The terrible costs that investment firms impose on their targets is driven home when we note that Bill Simon's firm cashed out of its investment in Simmons in 1989 by selling its stock in Simmons to the company's employee pension fund for $241 million of cash that was in the fund. That cash equaled twice what Simon's firm had paid for Simmons in 1986. The employee pension fund, when Simmons' shares plunged during a subsequent market slump, was left penniless. Now, in a way, it's a stretch for me to try to do this, but I would like to offer some hope that we can restore some semblance of independence to our economy's non-financial business sector. I suggest that business might become, once again, a viable engine for creating well-paying jobs and for meeting the public's needs for safe and useful products and services. But this will not happen if the financial sector is able to continue sating its limitless greed by using the power of the virtual economy that it controls to destroy the real economy on which our society's standard of living depends. How can we bring the financial sector under control and continually reduce its egregious influence on our lives? Let's be serious about this and put aside for the moment any suggestions for taming the monster with legislation or regulation. After all, legislation and regulation have been serving the monster's interests for decades. Instead of looking to the government for solutions, let's address the problem by asking the following question. What can Toyota's example teach us that might lead us out of the monster's clutches? I ask this question because of two facts about Toyota that seem to be surfacing. One, Toyota has never borrowed long-term debt. And two, Toyota has never raised equity capital. The company did list its shares ADRs, for the first time on the New York Stock Exchange only in 1999. But it's my understanding that that was done largely for political reasons. Some people on Wall Street said it was so that Toyota would look more like the big guys. It wasn't done to raise capital. It would seem that Toyota, before the present-day crisis, did not require ever the financial economy. For over 40 years, Toyota relied on internally generated finance. Indeed, their consolidated cash balance in recent decades usually runs in the $25 to $30 billion range, and often more. Wall Street gurus and financial experts commonly criticize such large cash holdings as a sign of top management inattention to shareholder interests that will make a company a target for corporate takeover artists. For Toyota, however, such cash balances made it possible to spend billions in the 1990s on hybrid powertrain development, leading to the highly successful Prius model, and to spend more billions sustaining its full-time workforce during the current recession. Were all non-financial companies able to emulate Toyota's disdain for external finance, it's unlikely that Wall Street and the global financial institutions it has spawned would exist today. While the chance is slim that such a happy condition might exist in our future, the possibility deserves attention. Finance experts usually take for granted that companies will borrow and issue stock. But what creates this need? To get to the source of an issue, Toyota urges its employees to ask why 5 times. So let us ask why of this assertion that companies must borrow and issue stock. Why? Well, because the demand for growth makes it necessary. Why? Because growth requires a lot of investment in capacity before it can be financed out of current earnings. Why? Well, initial earnings will not be sufficient to cover the costs of initial investment. Why? Because costs will exceed revenue until sales reach a certain level. Why? Because scale economies are present. Why? Because we build capacity to a larger scale than needed at first, in order to enjoy lower cost per unit later as sales rise. Now, at this point, a Toyota sensei or guru asking these questions might inquire, what if you build capacity as needed in small increments so that costs rise more or less in line with revenue, thus leading to profits and cash from the very first unit? Now, this vignette is based on the well-known fact that Toyota, from its pre-World War II beginning to the present, has always aimed at consuming no more resources, material, labor, supplies, power, capital, everything. It consumes no more resources than are necessary to produce what's needed at the moment to satisfy customer demand. They had little choice but to do this in their early years, especially after the war when scarcity was extreme. But over time, Toyota became adept at finding ways to continually do more with less. For Toyota, the pathway to achieving low costs, at which they have always excelled, was to reduce total costs by controlling and continuously reducing consumption of resources. That strategy not only ensured low costs, but also it made possible a profitable way of life, thereby eliminating the need to deal with financial institutions in financial markets. Now, by contrast, the American pathway to low costs has usually been to achieve low average costs per unit not total, but low average cost per unit of output. This is the metric that follows from the scale economy mindset. The easiest way to achieve low cost per unit, however, is to produce more units, not to reduce consumption of resources. Inevitably, the need to produce more in order to supposedly cut costs led over time in this country to larger and faster machines, more offline work to keep track of material flows, more need for marketing, advertising, and deal making to sell excess output, and so forth. In other words, producing more output to achieve lower cost per unit led to higher total costs, and thus, unfortunately, to the need to deal with the financial economy and large financial institutions. Now, in addition to emulating Toyota's highly disciplined approach to limiting growth to what is possible with internally generated resources, what other steps can reduce the global financial system's grip on the economy? Surely the most fundamental but most difficult step will be to focus the purpose of business activity on the essential concerns of humans and natural systems, on life, that is, rather than on financial concerns. If business is viewed as concerned above all with life, then its primary purpose is to provide people with meaningful and fulfilling livelihoods that satisfy the genuine economic needs of fellow humans in ways that harmonize with nature's life-sustaining system on Earth. Refocus the purpose of business on life, human and non-human life. Replace the long-standing story, composed and perpetuated by financial institutions, with a better story, a story about sustaining life, human and non-human. According to the story financial institutions have disseminated for the past 30 or more years, business exists specifically to maximize shareholder value. Focusing on shareholder value means seeing business through the narrow lens of accounting statements and financial abstractions, such as beta. That narrow lens binds us to the true purpose of business in a real economy, a purpose that requires diminishing the power and influence of the financial system. In an important sense, redefining the purpose of business in terms of human and natural systems puts the issue of sustainability front and center. All too often, sustainability is thought of as little more than a collection of desirable features to add to global corporations doing business as usual. In other words, sustainable features are seen as additions to publicly traded, shareholder value maximizing corporations that are firmly planted in the web of the existing financial economy. Such features include, for example, an increase in the efficiency of resource consumption, attention to working conditions of laborers in underdeveloped, low-income countries around the world where we have outsourced work, environmental programs to promote carbon-free energy sources, reduced use of toxic substances in manufacturing processes and products, designing products for easy and foolproof recycling. All of these features are valuable and commendable goals to achieve. None of them, however, addresses the ultimate concern of true sustainability. True sustainability requires conducting economic activity in a way that makes it possible for all life, human and non-human, to flourish on Earth indefinitely. Of course, we humans tend to regard ourselves as king of the hill. Every year, we make extinct tens of thousands of non-human life forms as our economic pursuits cause us to encroach on their habitat to serve our own ends in the name of profit-oriented, publicly traded corporations and the financial institutions that thrive off of them. Now, certainly an economic system dominated by large publicly traded companies focused on endless growth to achieve share price appreciation does not encourage a sustainability that allows all life to flourish. Indeed, I firmly believe that true sustainability in an economy dominated by publicly traded firms is an oxymoron. True sustainability might be possible, however, were businesses in our real economy to escape the destructive, growth-oriented, global emphasis imposed on them by the financial sector. Toyota was free of global financial institutions throughout virtually all of its modern history until very recently. Perhaps it will become Toyota's condition again, and the condition of companies that adopt Toyota's pursuit of true north and its habits of thought. As a general pattern, I would expect business activity in a truly sustainable economy to focus more and more on place, on the local, not on the global. For one thing, going local, in the regional watershed definition of that term, going local means operating more to human scale, making connections between actions and consequences visible so that externalities caused by distances in time and space between producers and consumers are reduced and even eliminated. After all, globalization of the economy in recent years means not just the spread of business activities across national borders. That's a trend that's been evident in the industrial world for over 150 years. It means, more importantly, the globalization of financial markets, markets that permit very few, very large financial institutions to conduct transactions of unprecedented magnitude across the globe with lightning speed. This has shifted all economic activity increasingly outside of national boundaries and made it rootless, even lawless, bounded only by the financial power and greed of a small number of extremely large financial institutions whose activities, by and large, lie beyond the reach of any national constraints. In the modern world, once economic activity is framed in financial terms, it becomes subject to global transacting and trading. All sense of place and locale, of people and nature, is lost. Humans become mere commodities, the same the world over, valued only for their price as labor and their spending as consumers. Financial wealth and the power it gives to control Earth's resources becomes concentrated in ever fewer hands, while increasing numbers of humans sink into poverty. Nevertheless, I think there is hope. It lies not in efforts to take over and control the financial economy. Rather, it resides in the discovery by businesses of ways to function without financial markets and without global financial institutions, a discovery that would make the financial economy largely irrelevant. If companies succeed at limiting growth to the extent of internally generated funds, they would not need to issue shares. They would not need public markets in which to trade shares. In the absence of those pressures, it would not be necessary to pressure companies to grow relentlessly. And without relentless growth, there would be much less pressure or opportunity to assume massive amounts of debt. This has been the pattern always seen in Toyota. Toyota followed these precepts during the decades after World War II, when they were becoming one of the world's most successful large corporations. Today, Toyota is paying for a decade when top management foolishly drove the company to grow to be number one in size in its industry, which it unfortunately did. But that obsession has ended, I think, at least for now. The company now seems to be on a path to restoring the thinking and habits that generated its original success. The challenge now is for all businesses to finally adopt the same thinking and disciplined habits. The result could be, I think, a real economy of businesses operating in harmony with Earth's capacity to sustain all life. And I think that surely is a purpose worthy of our highest dedication. Thank you very much. There is time for questions.
We have
or
45 minutes.
Pardon?
We have quite a bit of time.
Quite a bit of time, yes. Gentleman here, I hope I can see most of you.
Are you aware of other companies that do grow primarily without debt? and what's your experience of them?
You know, I haven't really studied the issue carefully enough yet to really be able to say that definitely. There are, yes. I think one company that is not publicly traded, but is very large and been very successful for over 60 years, is the Gore Company that makes the product we know as Gore-Tex. I think they're based originally in North Carolina, although I think they're worldwide now. I think they have operated without debt, without long-term debt. And they're very successful. And in fact, they have been written up in ways that convince me, I've never met them or talked with them, but it convinces me that they follow precepts much like what I call the management by mean thinking and practices in Toyota. Very much.
Thank you. I learned a lot from your speech, and this is not a field that I know anything about. So it sounds to me that you're not optimistic about the effectiveness of the Obama strategy of new regulation, new oversight, and that sort of approach. I had a question as I heard you talking, and that is that it's my nature to assume that decision makers in Merrill Lynch and J.P. Morgan Chase, who, by the way, owns my mortgage, I'm very afraid all of a sudden, and Citibank are not evil people. It's my nature to assume that. And so are there dialogues, or can there dialogues be taking place that sort of addresses, what essentially sounds in its final analysis to be loan sharking on the part of global financial institutions? And loan sharking is illegal, and it seems like we have an economy, a world economy, largely based on a legalized version of a pernicious, socially unacceptable set of behaviors. So my question is, are there dialogues, or can there be dialogues taking place that would reduce the pernicious aspects of the global financial monster that you've described?
Well, that's a good question, and in many ways it approaches the kind of suggestions I'm making here, in that I'm saying, I don't believe the solution to this is going to come out of government-developed regulation or laws. The public, we citizens, and people in companies that we deal with have to start pulling ourselves up by the bootstrap, in a sense. Maybe dialoguing, as you say, is part of that process, but it's something we're going to have to do. And it's obviously not going to be easy. One of the things people often ask me when I talk about this is, what about pension funds? What happens to all my investments in 401ks or whatever that's left anyway? And what you're talking about is all of this goes away, and I'm saying, yeah, I think in a way that's true, which means this isn't going to happen overnight. This is probably a generation or two long proposition. It'll have to happen gradually. And people have to wean themselves of the thinking that says you make money with money, and that's how you secure your future, and that's how you secure your well-being. Now, we live in a money economy, and there's lots of advantages to that. And a certain amount is obviously necessary and beneficial. But beyond a certain point, I think we focus on it too much. Instead, we should be focusing on investing in ourselves to participate more fully and actively in economic activities all of our lives. This idea of retiring and clipping coupons when you're 55 or 65 and live to maybe 90, like so many people today are going to, has never been true anywhere in history. And I don't see that it's likely to be true here in the near term or the long term. I mean, as you know, I mean, that kind of situation is asking one generation to work to support another. And anywhere large debt is involved, we're making the future hostage to our current demands, to our current requirements to accumulate, to grow rich. You know, where does this come from? It comes from the future. And what's profit? You know, corporations, we talk about the corporations have to make profit. Well, yeah, from a living system standpoint, if a living organism doesn't consume as much energy as it burns up in carrying out its activities, it's out of here. You know, you got to replenish the furnace regularly. But that's not incessant growth. That's a metabolic process, and we need to get into the thinking that, you know, that's what we're looking toward. That's what the economy will be about. It'll be an ecological system, not a pyramid that lifts people up to limitless amounts of wealth, as we call it, financial accumulation. So there's big changes in thinking, obviously, that I think have to be put on the table, have to be talked about. Most of all, from the vantage point I stand right now as an educator, I think, God, we've got to bring this in to the educational system. Young people have to start thinking about this from an earlier age. What is business? What is business about? Why do we do it? All of the students I know who are in a business school today, undergraduate, graduate, MBA, PhD, I don't care, if you ask them point blank, right on the spot, why does business exist? What's its purpose? 99% of the time or more, to maximize shareholder wealth. And where does that come from? From the first few pages of the finance text in their required core courses in finance or accounting that they take. That's why business exists. There's nothing human about it. There's nothing about the interaction of the business system with nature in any of this conversation. No, it's maximize shareholder wealth. Well, as long as we're turning out millions of graduates a year with that kind of thinking, and it's not just in the United States, I mean, this is all over the world now. The American MBA model is spread like oil on glass all over the world, and that's not going to be easy. There's got to be a desire, a willingness, and in many ways it's no different than I was talking about, well, how are we going to achieve control over the damage we're doing to the Earth's atmospheric system with our burning of fossil fuels and so forth? Well, this problem I'm talking about is no easier than that. and you all know, that. I mean, that's mind-boggling. What are we going to do? Every time you turn around, that the problem is still growing by any measurement people are taking, despite all the talk, despite all of the efforts. The vested interests are so strong. So, it requires, I think, finally a rethinking of what we're all about and what life is about, what human beings live for. We are the creature that is given the problem of creating its economy. All the other species of life on the earth just accept nature's economy as it's given. They know where the food is. They know what it takes to survive and reproduce and carry on. We're separated from that. We got separated from that ability somewhere way back. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, this is a fascinating problem we are beset with. I'd rather have it than not have it. But on the other hand, we've gone off in some crazy directions in fashioning this thing we call the economy. I think we need to bring it back to the fact that we need it for human purposes, for human reasons, and that's where we lost the way. Yeah, there were. Yeah.
Let me put some of your arguments in very personal terms. I owned my own business for 4 or 5 years. I purchased that business from an estate of a gentleman who had founded the business, and I borrowed money to buy that business. Now, with your argument, I wouldn't have done that. However, that business was successful, put a roof over my head, food on my table, and provided an education for my children. By your argument, I never would have done that. And I find that both wrong and offensive.
Well, let me say this. In the limited space I'm talking about here in this presentation, there are many qualifications I don't spend time making. One is that for the most part, what I'm talking about here, when I talk about businesses, is large publicly traded corporations. And I would gather that's not what you're. That's not.
I worked many years in financial services, publicly traded, and I don't find much difference. It's just a larger scale.
Well, I think that there are differences, though, in terms of what we perceive as the purpose of why we're doing this. I mean, it may be that for you, limitless growth, in order to increase market value of your business, may be the purpose. But I would think that that is more likely to be the purpose perceived by leaders of publicly traded companies than by leaders of private, closely held, non-publicly traded organizations. And that's a big difference. You know, I'm not arguing that we do away with business. I mean, that's a remarkable innovation, emergence that has occurred over thousands of years that enables us to provide for ourselves in remarkably efficient ways. But somewhere in this last 60, 70 years, we got completely off the track, I think, particularly in this country, as to what it's all about. And it's especially in the context of the large publicly traded corporations. And that's, of course, what the financial markets are primarily interested in. I mean, that's where their interest lies. But now even that, I think, is diminishing. I think their interest has now branched out into something much, much bigger, which involves the large financial companies. There's only maybe a dozen I'm talking about here in the whole world. They are now transcending business as such. For them, economic activities are there to be rated and traded, transacted. People are commodities. The activities you carry on in a business are to be treated as marketable commodities. You can break the business up and sell it anywhere in the world where you find the most advantageous situation to do so. I think that's a coming situation that we're going to see increasingly as time goes on, if this situation persists. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the when I was conversing with other people about the financial capital markets earlier in the conference, and I think you're asking the right question. What are financial capital markets for, right? It's not just about maintaining them blindly, but we need to pose the question, what are they for in terms of meeting our well-being, the health of our communities, our businesses, and the ecosystem. Is there another, I've got two questions. So is there another option of creating financial capital markets that tie to real capital, to kind of people, resources, et cetera? And then the other question I have for you is, what would be something we might be blind to that might be a similar problem that could emerge if everyone adopted the Toyota model? So what would be our kind of side effect or unintended side effect if everybody went that way. So that was my two-part question. One is the financial capital markets, the real capital being tied to financials, and the other one being around everyone taking on a Toyota model.
Okay, the first question, is there any way financial markets can function in the context of what I'm calling the real economy? Well, I mean, by definition, in a sense, the financial market is going to tell stories about the real economy in financial terms. It's going to deal in those terms. It's going to somehow virtual rather than real signs of financial wealth will appear if you've got those kind of markets. Now, the question is, how extensive do they have to become? How powerful do they have to become over those institutions that are in the so-called real economy, which is the economy that's really looking after the interest of or serving the interest of the human needs? And I don't know, how we would limit that power and still have those. I can still see a virtue, a value in there being lending and borrowing and lending. But does it have to get to the point where it's of the magnitude that really brought the house down in the last 2 years? And the more you look back at the postmortems now that are being done on that, this in many ways is a new thing. That I think, it has elements of the old, but there's a lot that's new in it that's very scary. And I think these institutions have acquired a power that they've never had before. There's a very good book I would recommend to everyone if to get into some of the history of this. I can't remember. I think the author's name is Lawrence Miller, but the title is The Speculation Economy. It's published by Barrett Kohler. It came out 2007. It looks like he finished it sort of just at the top, just before the bust came. But he was aware of and sensitive to changes that were coming, that there were some black clouds on the horizon. But he goes back to the time of J.P. Morgan, goes back to the late 19th, early 20th century, and traces through the evolution of this kind of market phenomenon and what purposes it did serve, from the earliest days when they were selling railroads to raise capital for, they were selling bonds to raise capital for railroads, and so on down to the line, to where stock became a tradable item that was of interest to them and finally became the major activity. They were, bonds proceeded in proportionate terms to a far lesser position of importance, and so on. And you go down, it talks about it through the 1920s and into the 30s and goes through the whole period of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and down and into the 90s. A rich storehouse of information. It's one of the best sources I've seen for general historical information on this. And I'm just beginning to, touching on it myself. Yes? Okay.
Are you suggesting that if one were to begin a small business, it would somehow be inappropriate to go to the bank and borrow money to do that?
No.
You're not, are you?
No. I mean, bank lending, particularly for short-term commercial purposes, trading purposes, is, that goes back thousands of years.
Right.
The phenomenon I'm talking about in many ways is the one described just in saying this very well in this book I just mentioned. This is something that takes off in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it's, for most of its early, for much of its early life, it's separated from banks. It's investment banking and brokerage and so forth are not overlapping with the commercial banks. That changed by the 1920s. That overlapping had occurred, much to the having a worse, much the worse for the economy in 1929, 30, 31, 32. And then in the Roosevelt administration, we passed, in the New Deal, we passed legislation like the Glass-Steagall Act that intentionally brought things back, separated these institutions, insurance companies, brokerage houses, banks, investment houses, and so forth. And that remained intact until the 1990s, and then we had the transformation that occurred during that decade that led to not only the repeal of Glass-Steagall, but a lot of other legislation that just totally broke down all the barriers between all kinds of financial intermediation activities. And the problem there was, I think, that you have these large investment banking houses now able to own commercial deposit banks and leverage up their deposits to lend loans for themselves to a degree that isn't allowed to the banks themselves, to the commercial banks themselves. That's my understanding of it. I mean, one article I saw just recently in the Times said, you know, in general, in the last 20, 30 years, in commercial banking, banks are limited to, or they have to hold roughly 10% of their deposits against the loans they issue. Okay, so which means you can loan up to like 10 times the deposit capital you've got on hand, the customer deposits on hand. Goldman Sachs and others in the 2000s, once the door was open to this, were somehow lending, I mean, we're creating debt, borrowing power, to the extent of 40 to 50 times the capital of these banks they now owned. It was illegal for the banks alone, isolated, sitting by themselves. Now, everyone said, well, if that's a risk that Goldman Sachs can manage, that's the way it is, and so on. So I don't know. No, for a small business, for any business, to go borrow from a bank, fine. Although I'm beginning to, you know, the more I read about what's happened in the last 2 years, I'm beginning now to, this isn't the first time in my life it's happened, but I'm going back and leaning toward advocating the abolition of fractional reserve banking. I think, and that's been something that's been advocated again and again in American history. And there's a lot of people now starting to write about it. Let's bring back this idea. Let's think about it. Let's do not allow banks to create money, which is what, you know, in the United States, our money is basically created by the banks, the bank at the top of the system being the Federal Reserve Bank with its 12 branches. Now, if we, what would we do? The government would print the money. The government prints the money. This was what the old greenback idea was in the late 19th century. This has been advocated many times over. And it's always said to be inflationary. Well, that's a dubious proposition, I think. It's clearly true that banks creating money do tend to have, ultimately, a tendency to create inflationary bubbles again and again and again. But that's because, you know, the creation of money is going along with the creation of debt. Whereas if the government just simply prints the money, and that's the way the money gets out, by the government spending it, there's no debt associated with that. So there's no incentive really to leverage up debt in the creation of money. And I think that's a big difference here between the fractional reserve banking we have and banks and government creating money by printing it. Yeah.
At the beginning of your talk, you were making reference to living systems and cosmology, yeah. And I totally understand the references to living systems through your talk, but I'm not seeing the connection with cosmology. Can you explain that a little bit more, please?
Well, there I'm borrowing on literature that started, well, when at least that I first encountered it, written by Brian Swim and his co-author Thomas Berry, who recently died. Their book, The Universe Story. I think The Universe Story, which was published in 1990, I think is still the best single quick read on this. You know, what have we learned from modern evolutionary cosmology? Call it the Big Bang theory, if you want. And one of the major things we've learned is that the universe is a system. The universe is a process. The universe is not just a collection of stuff that was put there, which is the perception of what the universe was all the way down through Darwin's time. I mean, Darwin saw evolution on the earth, animals, plants, okay. But when he looked up at the stars at night, oh, okay, that doesn't change. That's just there. Modern astrophysical cosmology today shows us that what we live in is a system in which matter and energy have been interacting for almost 14 billion years now to create ever evolving newness. Never stops.
So Galileo got in trouble for saying that it moves, right?
Yeah, he for part of this, he was in trouble. There have been a lot of people in trouble. The one who got in the most trouble back at his time was Giordano Bruno, who of course got burned at the stake for it. And Galileo was alive when that happened. He was a young man, and having been very much aware of that event, I think tempered some of Galileo's writings. But yeah. We're finally waking up to it, I think, now. This is, I think, the greatest. That was the single greatest breakthrough in human scientific history, human understanding, I think, of all time in the last 60, 70 years, modern evolutionary cosmology. Swim, Premack, Joel Premack's another one. These are physicists, astrophysicists, who take the story we're learning as scientists and expanding from it, extrapolating from it, and interpretation. What does this mean for humans, for human life, what we're finding out here? And it's profound, I think, what they come up with. Okay, thanks.
I live in Kentucky, and so we get a lot of news about Toyota, back to Toyota, in the general media, and we get a lot of news about Ford Motor Company because they also have a couple of big plants in Kentucky.
Oh, Kentucky, yeah.
And given all of the success that Toyota had with their model using living systems, how do you explain the fact that not only did they abandon it, the leaders that you described, but that other companies didn't, in fact, adopt the model of that led to Toyota's great success?
Well, that's the perennial question that Toyota observers are always asking. Why don't we see it spreading? We've been studying it now for at least 30, 35 years, very intensely. And yet, you can cite probably count on one or two hands a number of companies outside of the Toyota family. It includes their big suppliers like Denso and Aishin, which do, I think, pretty well emulate what Toyota does. But outside of the family, no, there aren't. And I think one of the answers is that in most companies, the thinking has focused management's attention on maximizing financial variables, targets, for so long that you can't jump out of that and become process-focused, become focused on process improvement in the way Toyota does. Because one of the things at Toyota that's always surprising for people to learn once you become familiar with what they're doing is they not only don't see that the business's purpose is to maximize shareholder wealth, they say our purpose is to thrive and survive as long as possible, making decent products for people, employing people under decent terms, and we continue to pursue what that means, even if following our light means we will from time to time suffer short-term financial setbacks. They keep focused on true north, as they call it. I mean, in technical terms, very, very briefly, the true north vision they have is an operating system that manifests continuous flow, what they call one by one unit at a time production, free of defects, with minimal consumption of resources, and all work done safely. And they are striving constantly to always move closer and closer to that ultimately unattainable goal, but there it is. And if at times they have to do some things in order to keep on, if they have to make choices between two things, one of which will cost more than the other, but it will keep you closer onto the path, they'll do that. Or at least they will take the path, the choice that's on the path that costs more, and then work assiduously to improve the process so that the costs will fall. But they're not managing cost targets. That's not their game. That's a fool's game. As with Deming, always. I mean, Deming was vigorously outspoken on that for decades. And that's one of his, at least one. It's embedded in at least one of his 14 points. He said, smart managers in companies can always achieve financial targets, even if they have to destroy the company to do so. And that's kind of the history of big business in America, I think, for the last 60 years. Let's see, I see a hand over here. Oh, I'm sorry, here, the mic.
I recently read, last year or so, Robert Reich's book, Supercapitalism. Are you familiar with that one?
I haven't read that particular. I know a lot of Reich's stuff.
Yeah. Very, very interesting juxtaposition with your view. What he's attempting to do is explain how it is that we stopped, and he's talking about everybody now, not just the companies, how everybody has become a consumer and an investor and is no longer a citizen.
Yeah.
And what he links that to is he doesn't really single out the global financial institutions as you do, which I think is a very interesting point of view. Well, you're talking about them being kind of at the center of another level of activity over and above the global corporations more broadly, which I think is a very interesting dimension to add. What Reich talks about is that essentially the whole system, every level of the system, has been driving toward short-term return.
Oh, yeah.
And everyone in this room is an investor who wants to maximize their returns. Okay? The problem is that we've all driven this system and created this system collectively together.
Yeah.
We are an experiment that Mother Nature or Father Cosmos or together they've conspired to create. We're another experiment. And we've gotten kind of out of control in a certain way.
Sure.
I would offer that it is very important to own it as something that we have collectively created, and not that certain concentrations of excessively greedy people, which may in fact exist, but I really don't think it's that helpful to think of it that way. I think it's more helpful to think about, we all have this aspect of ourselves, which has been unfortunately amplified by the large system that we've collectively created.
Well, I agree with you, and I think that's always a valid argument. But I think the one point I guess I would make is there are certain things going on in the financial economy that are relatively new and are a result of changes in laws and regulations and so forth, among other things. But they do have profound singular influence beyond anything in relation to the numbers of people who are involved and so forth. I mean, the wealth, the power of money is now available and being exercised to a degree never, I don't think, ever before possible.
So that sounds like an emergent property.
Well, yeah,
right?
It
You're
could,
talking self-organizing.
It could be considered that way. I don't know if that helps the analysis or not, but perhaps it's something one can analyze systemically, but it's one of the problems. Again, this makes me think. One of the problems here is we teach and we study and we practice business to a large extent under the influence of assumptions and theories, models that come out of modern economics, neoclassical and post-neoclassical economics. And the problem with neoclassical economics, which is absolutely and all entirely what guides someone like Larry Summers in Washington, is that there is no role in that framework for power, for the topic of power. Power does not exist in the economic model. Everything is mediated through markets. And markets under certain conditions mediate perfectly. What the economists want to talk about is, like, okay, what are those conditions? Assume they exist. Now let's talk about what the perfect outcomes are. And then we go ahead and shape policy, or we shape business decisions, or we shape economic decisions generally on the basis of these models, completely ignoring the fact that what's really happening in the economy is blatant, enormous power being exercised that controls the government, that controls business, that through various influences controls most of our thinking, through the media and through education. They control our educational institutions. Our educational institutions, to a large extent, exist to serve the interest of and to educate people to be participants in this system. I know from my experience in a business school, try to challenge these things in business schools. I have tested the limits of what it means to be a tenured professor about as far as you can go. And it doesn't, it's really like butting your head against a wall just all the time, all the time, all the time. So it's true, yeah, we're all in it, and it's a systemic thing and blah, blah, blah. But there are some specific things, I think, that we can go to work on. And that's one of them. Okay.
Everyone, let's on behalf of Pegasus, if it's okay, we're on our time limit, and let's thank Tom Johnson for intriguing us and inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you very much.